All right, so this is Dr. Joey Mimbs who's going to be giving us presentation, and I will let you go with it.
Well, Lillian, thank you so much for the opportunity. I want to say thank you and appreciate those who come to watch the presentation today. There'll be some time at the end for comments and questions. And this all comes out of a trip that my wife and I made as part of our work. We went to Senegal and Togo in West Africa in November and December of this past year. So along with work, the people that we care for, Americans living overseas, wanted us to see part of the country. And we were very happy when they took us to different slave houses. It was interesting. There was all kinds of emotions, from sadness to anger to asking lots of questions. My ancestors are all from the South, so many of them owned slaves. And so I was very curious, and it was very sobering, very, very sobering to be at both of these slave houses. One is called the Slave House in English on Gorée Island in Senegal. And the second is less known, less popular because it's not known. And that's the Wood House in Agbodrafo, Togo. What a name. So I'd love to share some of our the things we saw. Almost every picture that you're going to see is a picture that I took on the trip. There are a couple of maps that I grabbed off of the internet, more current maps, just to put the countries in relationship for you. But the pictures, everything else are things that we took on the trip. So yeah, so let's start with just kind of a brief little history of slavery. Slavery, the first in 1444, the first public sale of African slaves took place in Portugal, as far as we can document. Now, if you're like me in history, you find that someone else may have a little different date for some of these dates because it's so far back. But basically, you can see that slavery existed long before the era of time that we're going to discuss in just a few moments. The Portuguese started building a permanent slave trading post in what's now Ghana in 1482. Slaves started arriving in South America in 1510, and the first slaves coming to the Americas maybe 1518. That could include, I think the reference here is more to North America, but it could also include Central South America. And 1619, it would appear that slaves arrived in America and Virginia. So again, some of these dates you kind of say, well, that seems to contradict itself, but they're old dates, and slaves started coming here long before, again, the peak of the slave trade. The first slave house we're going to look at was built during the peak, which is the 1780s. That's sort of what is called the transatlantic slave trade when it reached its peak. So that's just a little bit of history to put into perspective what we'll see on Gorée Island. So remember the 1780s, that era, okay? It's also helpful to kind of understand this triangle that this picture was at Gorée Island. Ships would leave Europe, England, Denmark, other countries, and they would take goods down to Africa. And all along this African coast here, you can see my cursor moving. So it's kind of West Africa, down along the bottom of West Africa, and even coming further south into what is today Angola. This was all area where the majority of the slaves were taken from. Now, some were back here on the backside of Africa, but we feel the majority came from here. The goods coming from Europe would come here. Slaves would be placed on the same ships because the textiles, rum, manufactured goods, weapons were all unloaded. And then they were taken to the Americas. Don't think just United States. Americas means United States, Central America, all of the islands, Cuba, Haiti, all the Caribbean, and here in South America, especially Brazil. So slaves are coming into this area. Then the slaves are unloaded and the ships are reloaded again with sugar, tobacco, cotton, other crops grown in the Americas and taken back over to Europe. So that's sort of the trade and how this triangle just kept going. Now, I point that out because when we get to Togo, to the wood house, that house was built after slavery was banned in most places. But you can see that it's such a large area where slaves were being transported, it was hard to regulate. And some of these areas didn't cease slavery until very, very late, even later than the United States. I put this slide, the next two slides here, just to sort of point out a couple of things that I think sort of became confusing issues. This whole abolition movement started early. Vermont was the first sovereign state after the American Revolution in the United States to abolish slavery. Now, the first. That means I put that in red because not everybody else followed suit. So now it's sort of confusing in the states. You're going to have some states against slavery and some for slavery, and it makes it confusing trying to regulate slavery. England started early with this movement of abolition of slavery. Denmark banned the import of slaves in 1792, although in red, although kind of confusing, the law only took effect in 1803. So you have 11 years that's kind of this confusing. Is it banned? Is it not banned? And how do you make that switch so quickly? The United States passed legislation in 1800. They debated it fiercely in 1787 at a constitutional convention, finally passed legislation to prohibit international slave trade, but the law the act didn't take effect till 1808. So again, to me, that's just sort of confusing. And then it didn't stop the slavery in America. It was just international slave trade. But that kind of opens the door for illegal international slave trade, which happened. We have cases, court files where ships were seized and they had slaves on it, and it's well after 1808. So slaves are still being smuggled into America, the United States, and other countries. So these acts and laws meant well, but they didn't solve the problem because often states that impose these still had slavery. And that's going to play into, again, especially Togo, okay, and what's going on when we get to Togo. So kind of this, remember this background. Britain in 1807 outlaws the Atlantic slave trade, but again, Atlantic, not necessarily in England and all of its colonies. Spain tries to abolish slavery, but Cuba rejects that. They rejected the ban. So that, again, in the Caribbean leads to kind of some confusion. This painting was at Gorée Island, and it just caught my eye. It's just very sad to me, so I took a picture of it. More dates. We won't spend a lot of time here. I wanted to point out 1817 that France banned slave trading, but it didn't take effect till 1826. So again, a little confusion, leaves the door open. 1833, Britain passes the Abolition of Slavery Act, ordering the gradual abolition of slavery. That word gradual caught my eye. And then plantation owners could be rewarded because their slaves were going to be gone and they needed money, but nothing was given to the slaves. So it was just kind of a mixed up system. The other dates just kind of talk about this gradual abolition, but Brazil, 1888, even Cuba, 1886, they didn't abolish slavery till well after the United States. And again, kind of leaving the door open for a lot of illegal slave trading. There was another piece of history that I had never learned in school, and so I included that. And this is part of what you would see at the slave house in Gorée Island in Senegal. And it's about Signorais. And this is a picture of a Signorais seated in the chair, and other Africans are around her, maybe some of her children. It comes from a Portuguese word, senora, and it came to describe African women who had married European merchants, officials, soldiers. They stayed in what was called the Senegambian coast. Gambia is a little country that comes into and surrounded by Senegal. You'll see that on the map in just a moment. And the Signorais were mixed race, and many reports will refer to them with the term used in their day of mulattoes. And these women, these Signorais, were African, although mixed race African, and very, very powerful. And they helped run this, well, they ran the slave houses. Signorais were never considered to be slaves. And because they were mulattoes, this is the explanation underneath the picture I just showed you at Gorée Island. A Signorais seated in the center with other women who may be enslaved or free. Note the mix of African and European furnishings, which can also be found in inventories of Signorais' possessions. From an watercolor by Stanislaus, hard name, originally published in West Coast of Africa, the Views, Scenes, and Sketches, 1890. So these Signorais were very wealthy, powerful, influential people, and they ran the slave houses and were very important to the slave trade. So that's sort of our little background. And you'll need to know that for Gorée Island, because the Signorais ran Gorée Island, the slave house. So the first stop on our little tour is Senegal. Senegal is very diverse. It's sort of a deserty country. It's not beautiful in the sense of everywhere you go, wow, look at this beautiful scenery. It's got its own beauty, but it's kind of a deserty type of beauty. Some of our friends who live and work there would be the first to say, oh, we're not real sure it's beautiful. But then, you know, they come from New England or other places in America that we would say is very, very pretty. So it's just a different kind of beauty. You can see in the upper right of the screen that it's on the African coast and west coast. And in this map of Senegal, you can see the Gambia that comes in sort of like a snake. So that is the Senegambian coastline. Dakar is the capital. And so here, right here, this little marker off of the coast of Dakar is our little island of Gorée Island. Very ethnically diverse, and the tribes don't all get along. In countries in Africa, they don't, like in Senegal, the people wouldn't consider themselves Senegalese. They don't consider themselves, we're all African, we're all Senegalese. No, they would say we're Fulani, because that's their tribe, and they would identify themselves by their tribe. So whatever tribe they're from is how they will identify themselves. So, and it's still conflict, and they don't get along, they don't necessarily like each other. So that still exists today, and it existed back in slave days. So that's sort of a piece of history we need to know, that tension still goes on today in countries in Africa. Beautiful country. I could show you lots and lots of pictures. I won't, but I'll show you a few. It's this mixture of arid because of the desert. It's on the border of the Sahara Desert. And this was us landing on the left, but we spent some time at a resort house with our teammates, and it's on the ocean, and you can see it's very, very beautiful. I got some beautiful sunset pictures, but very diverse and very a land of contrasts. I took the picture in the top right so people would see that in this, this was coming off of the interstate. So this is the exit loop off the interstate. And I zoomed in, and modern cars, nice cars, but people washing and selling their goats right there in that little loop. And just a big contrast of the people. There's contrast of religion. It's predominantly Islam, but there are a lot of Christians. People get along. It's not a militant Islamic country. There's freedom there of religion, but there's social, economic diversity. And you would see men and women carrying things on top of their heads even today. So that tradition goes way back. Someone at an intersection would meet you, and I thought it was great, by the Land Rover's fancy store. Here this man's got his goods, his bread, his water, all on his head. He's going to come out at the intersection and try to sell you goods. So very diverse land, this Senegal. This map was taken at Gorée Island at the slave house, and it's of the island. Their explanation talks about the free and enslaved Africans. They all lived here. Some of the enslaved people were very well educated, well skilled, and the women would run the houses, much as the slaves who were brought to America. The same things could be said of the slaves who, they crossed the ocean. And it was these seigneuries that ran these slave houses, and they're very, very powerful. So I took a picture of the island. The only way to get there is by boat. There are no cars on the island. There's not a bridge. It's about 1.25 miles from the coast. The island's not huge. It's about 45 acres. And today there are homes. There's still a fort and a military battery. Homes, public garden. There's at least one church. There's a mosque, all kinds of shops, restaurants. It's a tourist attraction today. But it's a very beautiful island, and it was very beautiful back in the day and when the slave house was active. Just a few pictures showing some of the beauty of the island. And the slave house sat right in the middle of all of this. But I found it to be very colorful. The walls were painted beautifully. So right in the middle of all this beauty is something that makes us very, very sad. This is the slave house, the house of slaves. The French name, Maison des Esclaves. I probably just murdered that because I don't speak French. This picture is hanging there, and it's a painting of Anne Colas Pepin's house that was done in 1839. Now, the house was built by her father, Nicholas Pepin. He was mixed race, Afro-French. Depending on who you're reading, the house was built sometime about 1776 to 1784. Now, remember what we saw earlier? That's the height of the Atlantic slave trade. So it's built right there at the peak of that. This mixed race, his sister Ann Pepin and his daughter Ann Colas Pepin were both Cygna rays. So they're mixed race. They would have been referred to in the day as mulattoes. Beautiful women. Ann Pepin may be one of these fairer skinned women in this picture. We don't know that for sure. And I could not find a picture of her anywhere. So I don't know that it exists. But they oversaw this slave house. And Ann Pepin, Nicholas's sister, ran other slave houses. She had a relationship with the governor, and a very powerful woman. So the tribes, let's say the Wolof people are fighting against the Fulani, and the Fulani and the Wolof don't like each other. So the Fulani capture a bunch of Wolof because they're warring, and there's this tribal descent. So the Fulani have all of these captives, and they want to get rid of them. They're going to kill them. But along come the Europeans or the Americans and say, hey, we'll buy your captives. We'll give you guns and food. And the Fulani go, well, that's great because we don't want these Wolof around anyway. So the Americans or the Europeans would buy these captives and take the Wolof captives off of the hands of the Fulani and move them into the slave trade. So the slave houses built up so they could help promote this, and the Americans, Europeans kind of fed, and this conflict was motivated to keep going because you capture your people, you kidnap them, you kidnap your enemies, kidnap or fight against, and your enemies capture them, and then you're going to get paid for them. So that was sort of the background, and that history is all explained at the slave house. I took this picture standing out front. It's sort of built up, so I couldn't get all of it because I couldn't step far enough back. But you can see the colors. It's been fairly well preserved. It just was really beautiful outside. But then you step out of the beauty of Goree Island here into the slave house. This upper level would have housed the people who lived there, like the Pepin family. The lower level would have been the barracks, the prison for the slaves. So the upper level, you can look out and again see that the island is real pretty. A lot of these little alleyway streets, and I just thought it was very attractive. It sort of has that quaint feel, like you love to walk and pop in a little shop and buy some art or get a cup of coffee. And you can very quickly forget the ugliness of the slave house and what was going on. The bottom level was quite different. You had these rooms with either no windows or little slits. I'll show you one of those. And the slaves were chained in here. These rooms were packed. They could have been there for, a few days to months and months. They waited for the ships to come. The ships would dock right outside this door. This door is called the Door of No Return. And the slaves were taken from these dungeon areas and loaded onto the ships here. And they passed through that door, and it's the Door of No Return. Men and women were separated. Children were often separated from the women and men. And at best, you had a little slit. You may have had nothing. You couldn't see out at all. They were damp. Many died. It just very unpleasant. This one was actually pretty well lit, but again, that's with modern lighting. I can't imagine back in the day how dark it would have been, how gloomy. And there you are, you're on an island, 1.25 miles. Even if you got out of the slave house, where are you going to go? It's too far to swim across the ocean. And of course, it was guarded. So you got captured, you got taken here, your life as you knew it was just over. These two pictures are of information that was on the wall at Gorée, and I wanted to kind of share that because it documents some of what I've just shared with you. In the part of Africa known as Senegambia, that would be Senegal and the Gambia, victors sold captives from war, including women and children, between kingdoms and to the north in the trans-Saharan slave trade. So one king captures people from another tribe. That king loses, he loses a bunch of people, and they're sold. And the Europeans, Americans fed this. And of course, we wanted the slaves. We felt we needed them for our economy and working farms. So it kept this warring going on Gorée Island and at Maison des Esclaves, the House of Slaves. Enslaved Africans lived and worked here. Traders enslaved and sold other Africans for export to the Americas. In the exhibitions, we learned more about all the people that lived there. And some were slaves, some were the women who ran the slave houses. The number, this was interesting. Today, the exact number of Africans taken from Gorée to the Americas is understood to be considerably less than originally thought. Some of the locals would tell you that it's 1.2 million or hundreds of thousands rather. Hundreds of thousands of people came through Gorée Island. But as they've done more research, now they don't have records, but they feel like it's much fewer than what they first thought. But still, 33,000 people coming through Gorée. That's just staggering to me. They were taken from their homes and shipped across the ocean. So there are no records. I mean, you can't say, well, my family was slave. I'm going to go to Gorée Island and look through the records and get on their computer and dig through files. Those don't exist. So DNA research is getting more and more specific to location. So DNA might help you pinpoint, but then it might depend on where you were captured, because one king captured you from another kingdom or another tribe, and your tribe could have been in the Gambia or Niger or some other place. So maybe you didn't actually come from Senegal, you were just captured and brought into Senegal, loaded on a ship after you spent time at Gorée, and taken wherever, Brazil, United States, the islands, England. So you could have been taken anywhere. So you can't run to Gorée Island and say, I want to look up my ancestors. There are displays all through the slave house. It was a little difficult to get pictures of the whole thing because of the length and angle, the shapes of the rooms, and these bright lights that were shining. I tried to take some of the glare off of the pictures, but you can see these shackles. I just stood there looking at them and was overwhelmed with sadness to think that these shackles were on people's arms and legs and necks, and they were bound, and it just made me very, very sad, actually. I found myself wanting to apologize to somebody because my ancestors owned slaves, and I know I'm not responsible for my ancestors' actions, but it just, when you're standing there, it gives you all kinds of emotions, from sadness to anger to confusion, back to sadness. It's very sobering, as I mentioned. This picture is on the wall at Gorée Island, and I took a picture of it. It again shows more of the European Americans. Probably they may have gone out and captured some of the people in the tribes, but it's more likely that an African tribe captured people from another tribe. And this picture is portraying the people being taken from a slave house to the ships. You can see the ship up in the top left, and they have purchased these people from a slave house, and it just is a very sad picture to me. Local, here's the number I wanted to say earlier. Local people in Gorée at one point said 15 to 20 million slaves passed through Gorée Island. That number's probably way too high. So depending on who you read, it's 26 to 33,000. But again, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of slaves. And the Gorée still exported till the slave trade was finally abolished, an act of 1817, but it didn't really fully take effect until 1826. So remember, the house was built back in the 1780s. So 30, 40 years as a slave house, at least somewhere in there. So a lot of people came through this slave house. Now we're going to make a jump. We're going to leave Senegal. We're going to stay on this African coast because, again, the slave trade came from this area down around the southern southwest loop here and on down. It went further south. But we're going to this little country here called Togo, which is next to Benin. This center map shows a little better Togo and Benin. Lomé is the capital of Togo. Another little piece, I'll just kind of throw this in, it does come into play at the end of the presentation, is Togo and Benin are the home of voodoo. We often think as Americans that voodoo comes from Haiti, but voodoo actually comes from Togo and Benin and was brought into Haiti by the slaves. This is the home here. We saw voodoo temples, voodoo shrines, they have voodoo celebrations. There's a special section of the market that we went to, that we walked through, is all voodoo. That's here in Togo and Benin. This map is going to be important in just a moment because here's Lomé and here's Anaho. And the king that I'm going to talk about in a moment, he originally was in Anaho, and there was tribal conflict, and he left Anaho, and but that was his home. There's a big slave market in Anaho, and it was shut down when slavery ceased to exist. And then ships would come in here to this port here at Benin, and the ships would come in looking for slave traders in this area. So the king was in Anaho, Togo. He's going to move, and they're going to build this house and to hide the slave trade and to try to keep these ships and officials from finding their house here in Togo. The village they're going to is between Lomé and Anaho, not far from Anaho. More about where this town is, but it's a different town. It's got a big name. Very similar to Senegal, a little more tropical. And again, I could show you many pictures. Here are just a few. Men and women still carry things on their head. We were on the ocean, very tropical. I loved this picture of these women sitting by the road, selling anything from fish to fabric to maybe some kind of grain. Very beautiful, some beautiful spots in Togo. Here's our slave house. Let me tell you about the slave house. So it's called the Wood House. It's in the little town of Agbodrafo. And it was built by a Scottish slave trader. Sometimes you'll see him referred to as English, a Scottish slave trader, John Henry Wood. So the king, King Asayakole, his tribe was in Anaho, that little town I pointed out to you. a couple things happened. There was conflict within the tribe. So he picked himself up with his followers and moved out of Anaho and moved just a little bit west, still close to the coast, and to the little town of the little village of Agbodrafo. And the slave trade, all these laws are taking effect. I mean, America's passed this anti-slave international slavery law in 1808. Well, yeah, it took effect in 1808. England in 1807, affecting colonies. France, the slave trade in their colonies is banned in 1817, but it really didn't take effect till 1826. So that's why I pointed out all those dates. It's a little confusing, and all the dates, it's confusion on when's it actually over, and it's over in the colonies but not the countries, and then gradually in the colonies but not all colonies, and so it is still happening. But King Asiakole, he didn't want the slave trade to end because he had this lucrative trade. And even though there were injunctions by all these Western powers and there's surveillance coming into that Gulf of Benin, he found the slave trade to be real profitable. So he could still capture or sell his fellow Africans. And there was still Americans and Europeans that wanted to buy them. John Henry Wood didn't want to stop the slave trade because he also found it profitable. So one day, John Henry Wood walks into the little village of Agbodrafo in Togo, and he meets the king. And the short version of a long story is they come up with this agreement that they're going to build a house. So John Henry Wood builds this house. This is it. Now, let me insert that the Wood house has not been kept up as well as the slave house in Goree Island. They don't have the funding. A lot of it's all original, and the furniture and things inside are all original, but you're going to see the ceilings are falling down. Some of the wood has been rotted through. It's the original boards. When you walk into this house, you're kind of walking into a dilapidated version of how it actually was in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s until it stopped in 1852. It has kind of some features are Brazilian in the style of the house. Others are more European. And they built this house to be very deceptive. It was built out in the woods. So today it's surrounded by a village. But in 1835 in Agbodrafo, this is all surrounded by like jungle. So you couldn't just go see this house. And they did that on purpose. And it was built with a cellar and these crawl spaces, which I'll show you more up close in just a moment. And these crawl spaces are how the slaves were made to enter into the house. The same premise, the king, either his people or some warring tribes would capture people from Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, some maybe Togo, Benin, and the captives were sold here, and then he would sell them to John Henry Wood. All illegal because the international slave trade was over, but they didn't want it to be over. So this is a look inside, and you'll quickly see that it's not nearly as well kept, and that's simply because they don't have the finances. These chairs are original. The safe was original. These furniture pieces are all original. The rooms were sparsely furnished. There were 6 bedrooms and a living space upstairs. The slave traders could live there, so it made the appearance of upstairs. It's just a regular living house. So if some inspector came, it looks like just a regular house, and people were living there. It's named the Wood House after John Henry Wood, not because it's all made of wood, but that was his name. In the living area is a little door that goes to the crawl space. Well, this was normal. Houses that had crawl spaces, like in Great Britain, would often have this little door. We actually went down in here. This crawl space is very tiny. You could not stand up, but you could crawl around. There's no ladder. You had to just kind of get down in the hole and sort of drop. And then when you got out, you had to come stand back in the hole and use your arms and get out. So they have a little door here, and that door was removed, and you could look down into the crawl space. I can't tell you how sad it made us thinking about the hundreds of people who were crammed into these crawl spaces. Now, this entrance. The entrance went into the cellar, the crawl space. It was just under 5 feet tall, so there was no way you could stand up. You could crawl around. Most of the slaves had to remain seated or crouched or lying down. It was a prison for thousands. Again, there are no records. You can't go to the Wood House and say, I want to pull up the records, show me the files. They don't exist. But people from all of these countries, it's believed, were captured and taken here into this crawl space. Oh, let me mention that those entrances to the cellar were made to be deceptive. Houses had those entrances, but these were just a little bit bigger. They were just large enough so a person could crawl through, but they're not so large that you would question, why is that so large? So they did that on purpose. And they had a crawl space around the exterior of the house. So if someone came to inspect it and they looked in that little entrance to the cellar, they would just see this crawl space around the exterior of the house. And then you'd have to actually get in there and crawl and go through another little door to get into this cellar underneath the house. So they tried to hide all of this so people wouldn't find it. And you can see some of the ceilings missing here, but you can't stand up in this. And it's just kind of just the way it was. And slaves were crammed in here. They would stay for days, maybe months, waiting on a ship. Hundreds, thousands of people came into this area. All secret. It lasted until 1852. It only stopped because John Henry Wood and the king felt like they were about to get caught, and they shut it down. It wasn't shut down because the authorities made them, from what I'm told. About a mile or so from the house is the chained well, often referred to as the Well of Forgetfulness. The slaves were marched from the Wood House to this well. And there are all these markers, but they're in French. So I didn't try to get too up close because I don't read French. Our guide explained them to us. And here's the well. Here's looking down in the well. And the slaves are marched there for this final purification bath on African soil before they were taken back here behind the well. This is the ocean, and they were loaded on the ships. And this is the final step. This well, here, you can see the ocean back here, about a mile. And it's called the Well of Forgetfulness because African oral tradition says that the slaves were forced to march around the well 7 times. And it's believed that there was even a little ceremony. It could have been even a voodoo ceremony, some of the local people feel, to help cause people to forget their African life and to let go of their religion and their gods, to kind of guarantee to the slave traders that the slaves had abandoned their ties to any supernatural forces. This picture shows them marching, this engraving rather, was on a wall at the slave house. They were taken from the Wood House to this well about a mile away, had to take a bath, march around 7 times, probably a little voodoo ceremony, loaded out here on the ships. Hopefully they forgot their African life, forgot their people. There was no return, and taken who knows where. At this point, this is all illegal. They could have been smuggled into England, probably more likely the Americas, or South America, the islands, because slavery was still legal, remember, in Brazil and Cuba until 1880s. So they could have easily been taken there against the law, but still taken there. This was probably one of the most sobering places. Every piece of it. Goree Island was sobering, standing in the cells. The wood house, crawling down in that little crawl space. Oh, wow. But something about standing at the well of forgetfulness just overwhelmed my wife and me. And we found ourselves just saying, Lord, we're so sorry for slavery and so glad it doesn't exist in America today. So that was our trip. And you can't run to either of these slave houses and say, let me go through the records. But DNA may show one day which who came from where. But the chances are, good chances are, some of our ancestors owned slaves who passed through Goree Island or the wood house in Togo. So that's a very, very real possibility. At this point, I'm going to turn it back to you, Miss Lillian, and thank you for allowing me to share our trip.
Thank you so much for that presentation.